They say memory is a tricky thing, that the way we recall our childhood often shifts to match the stories we tell ourselves later, but I remember everything. I remember the sound the screen door made when it slammed shut behind Jason as he ran off on another adventure. I remember the way Mom's eyes followed him with a softness she never had for me. I remember how, even when I was 5 years old, I learned to make my own cereal in silence, careful not to spill milk or make noise or ask for too much. And I remember the exact moment I realized love, in my family, wasn't something freely given, it was something you earned, if you were lucky. I was 12 years old when it truly hit me. Not in a dramatic, screaming, glass-shattering kind of way, but like a slow, cold rain that soaked through every layer until even my bones felt heavy. But to understand that moment, you have to go back with me. You have to walk into the house on Elmwood Avenue where the walls were beige and always slightly sticky in the summer, where the living room carpet had a stain from Jason's grape juice spill that Mom never made him clean up, and where my mother, Marion, moved through life with a kind of clipped efficiency that made warmth feel like a foreign luxury. From the outside, our house looked respectable. We had the little things that made a middle-class family seem intact: a roof that didn't leak, 2 bedrooms upstairs, a backyard with a sagging swing set, and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of bleach and overcooked rice. But the truth was, the real structure of our family was built on performance. You were useful, or you were invisible. Marion never yelled. She didn't need to. Her silence carried the weight of judgment more effectively than any shout could. She was a woman of tight buns and tighter budgets, a single mother in the practical sense, since my father had disappeared long before I formed full sentences. Some said he left. Some said he died. Marion never clarified, and Jason never asked. As far as I was concerned, Dad was just another ghost in a house already haunted by unmet expectations. Jason, my older brother by 6 years, was the sun around which our family orbited. He had that golden boy charisma that made teachers overlook late homework and neighbors offer him odd jobs just for the pleasure of his smile. He could be cruel, pinching the soft part of my arm when no one was looking, taking the last popsicle even when he knew I wanted it, but Mom always laughed it off. "Boys will be boys," she'd say, as if that excused everything. I was the opposite. Quiet. Observant. The kind of child who memorized the sound of footsteps and learned to read moods like survival maps. I did the dishes without being asked. I color-coded my school folders. I knew which brand of fabric softener Mom preferred and which days Jason had football practice. I gave, always hoping that if I just did enough, I would be seen, noticed, maybe even loved. But Marion didn't do sentiment. When I brought home a straight-A report card in 4th grade, she nodded and said, "Well, that's what's expected." When Jason got a B- in history the same week, she made his favorite meatloaf and said, "He's doing his best." I learned then that expected meant invisible. That excellence from me wasn't a cause for celebration, it was a baseline. There was this one day, God, I can still feel the sting of it, when I overheard Marion talking to Mrs. Langford, our next-door neighbor. I had come in from the backyard, my hands dirty from pulling weeds like she'd asked, and I paused just outside the kitchen, not out of nosiness, but because the tone of her voice was so dismissive. "Anna," she said with a tight sigh. "She's responsible, not special." Jason, that's the one with potential. I didn't cry. I just stood there, clutching the gardening gloves, listening as they went on to talk about Jason's new tutor and how he might get a sports scholarship if things went right. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, the world narrowing to the sound of my heartbeat in my ears and the sharp click of Marion's spoon against her coffee mug. Later that night, I scrubbed the dirt from under my fingernails until the skin was raw, and I told myself it didn't matter. That she didn't mean it. That maybe, just maybe, if I got first place in the science fair or won the spelling bee or learned how to bake that lemon tart she liked from the magazine, she'd see me. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Jason could show up late to dinner, leave his laundry all over the floor, snap at her when he was tired, and he was still the chosen one. Once, on Christmas, I spent weeks making gifts. I painted a little jewelry box for Marion, with tiny vines along the edge that matched the pattern on her favorite teacup. For Jason, I made a scrapbook of all his football clippings, arranged chronologically, with captions and even jokes he used to tell. I wrapped them in paper I'd saved from old grocery bags and tied them with bits of ribbon I collected from school craft bins. When Christmas morning came, I laid them under the tree with shaky hands, my heart pounding like it already knew what was coming. Jason, of course, had brought nothing. He flopped onto the couch, said Merry Christmas, and scrolled through his phone. But when he finally got up and tossed Marion a half hug, she lit up like the tree behind her. "Oh, Jason," she said, her voice suddenly 2 octaves warmer, "you didn't need to get me anything. You being here is enough." She didn't open my gifts right away. When she finally did, her smile was polite, tight. "You're very thorough, Anna," she said, turning the jewelry box over like she was looking for a receipt. Jason looked at the scrapbook and said, "Weird," then tossed it onto the floor beside the couch. I excused myself and spent the rest of the day in my room, listening to their laughter echo down the hallway and wondering what kind of daughter I would have to become to be loved like that. But I never stopped trying. That was the worst part. Even after every slight, every ignored effort, every time Marion turned her affection toward Jason, like it was sunlight and I was a shadow she didn't know how to warm, I still hoped. I still believed that if I just found the right formula, the right words, the right moment, I could earn a place at their table. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Love, I had convinced myself, was something you worked for. But even at 12, some truths started settling in my bones, truths I didn't yet have words for. That loyalty to people who don't see you doesn't make you noble, it makes you disappear. That being useful is not the same as being loved. That families can be made of shared blood and still leave you starving for affection. And yet, I stayed. I smiled. I kept cleaning the kitchen, folding the laundry, and organizing Marion's receipts just the way she liked them, all while whispering to myself that maybe next time, she'd call me special. Maybe next time. There's a distinct moment, so quiet you might miss it, when a child begins to understand that the love they're chasing doesn't live in the walls they call home. It doesn't scream, or slap, or rage, it just withholds. It just forgets your name when praise is handed out. It just opens its wallet for one child and closes it for another. And that moment, when it hits, it splits something down your center, sharp as glass and twice as cold. For me, it happened one rainy October afternoon at the DMV, holding a pen and co-signing for a car I would never drive, for a brother who barely remembered my birthday. Jason, of course, had a way of making his mistakes sound like other people's responsibility. He was 20 now, barely scraping through a string of part-time jobs, each shorter than the last. He dropped out of community college after one semester, citing creative differences with his professors, which in reality meant he never turned in a single paper. He said he had big plans involving music, maybe a podcast, maybe photography, whatever sounded impressive enough to distract from the fact that he spent most of his time asleep or stoned. Marion, naturally, believed in him. "He's just finding himself," she said, as if the trail of unpaid rent, ghosted employers, and borrowed money was some kind of spiritual pilgrimage. And when he needed a new car because he'd wrecked the last one on a late-night Taco Bell run, she didn't hesitate to come to me. "You're the only one with good credit, Anna," she said. Setting a mug of tea in front of me like this was a warm family favor, not a manipulation. "You've always been so responsible. It would just be a temporary arrangement until Jason gets back on his feet." I looked at her across the kitchen table, noting the way her fingers traced the rim of the mug instead of meeting my eyes. "And what if he doesn't?" She sighed like I was being deliberately difficult. "He's your brother. You know he'll come through. You kids used to be so close." That was a lie. We were never close. We shared blood, not bond. But I didn't argue. I rarely did back then. I was 17, about to graduate high school with honors, juggling a part-time job at the library and a handful of scholarships that I'd earned through sheer desperation to escape. I knew better than to say no to Marion when she had that tone, the one that sounded like guilt dipped in honey. So I signed the papers. I watched Jason swagger into the parking lot with keys dangling from his fingers and Marion beaming, like she'd just watched him receive the Nobel Prize. I didn't even get a thank you. Just a pat on the shoulder from Marion and a shrug from Jason. "You know I've got you," he said, winking. "We're family." 3 months later, the payments stopped. For months in, the collection calls started. By the time I called the bank and heard the words "vehicle repossessed," my stomach had already learned the shape of betrayal. I confronted Marion that evening, holding the bill like it was proof of something sacred being violated. "You co-signed, Anna," she said, not even pausing as she folded laundry in the living room. "That means it's your responsibility too." "But it wasn't my car," I snapped, louder than I intended. "He promised." "And you believed him?" Her voice cut through the room like frost. "You know how Jason is. You should have known better." That was the moment. The fracture. The realization that being the responsible one in this family didn't make me loved. It made me the scapegoat. It made me the safety net. It made me disposable. From then on, everything changed. Slowly, like a door closing one click at a time. I still gave gifts at Christmas, handmade ones, thoughtful ones, the kind that took hours of planning and care. Jason gave nothing, as usual, unless you counted the chaos he carried with him like a cologne. And Marion, well, she handed me an envelope that year with a note that said, "We're struggling. Please remember your family. Love, Mom." Inside was a receipt from the grocery store and a barely concealed ask for more money. I stared at it while Jason unwrapped a new leather jacket she swore was a gift from someone at church. There was no one at church. Marion hadn't stepped foot in a pew since I was 10. But lies, in our house, were dressed up in concern and served with a side of obligation. That year, I wrote a check for $200, handed it to her with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, and went upstairs before the tears reached my throat. I applied to colleges quietly, like someone planting contraband in enemy territory. I told no one when the acceptance letters came in. Not Marion. Not Jason. Not even the guidance counselor who always said, "Your family must be so proud of you." They weren't. They didn't even know. Pride was a luxury reserved for golden sons and daughters who didn't require effort to love. When I left for college, Marion barely looked up from her crossword. "Don't forget to call," she said, like I was going to summer camp, not a different universe. Jason didn't even show up the day I packed my things. He had plans, which probably meant sleeping through the afternoon and borrowing money from someone else. College was like breathing fresh air for the first time in a lifetime of smoke. I found a roommate who cried with me when I said my mother had never hugged me without a reason. I met professors who praised my essays without backhanded compliments or comparisons to a sibling who never read a book in his life. I discovered therapy, tucked away in a campus building that smelled like old pencils and fresh starts. I sat on that couch and said, "I'm not sure I'm allowed to be angry." And the therapist, a woman with soft eyes and steel beneath her voice, said, "You are absolutely allowed." So I let it out slowly at first, then in floods. I talked about the Christmas notes and the co-signing. I talked about how Marion only smiled when Jason entered the room, how her voice softened for him like he was a guest, and I was the help. I talked about the years I spent trying to earn affection, like love was a paycheck you could clock into if you just worked hard enough. And I began to see the truth. That my role wasn't daughter, it was function. It was filler. It was glue to hold the family together when no one else bothered to try. I still came home on holidays, at least at first. Part of me still hoped for a change, still yearned for that flicker of recognition, that moment when Marion might finally say, "You matter to me." But it never came. That pivotal Thanksgiving, I brought a pie I made from scratch. I'd spent all night baking, remembering how Marion once mentioned liking cinnamon. Jason was already there when I arrived, sprawled across the couch like royalty, eating chips straight from the bag and telling a story about how he almost got a job at a radio station. They said I had presence, he boasted, not noticing how Marion beamed like he'd cured cancer. During dinner, I passed him the mashed potatoes and asked, casual as I could, "Hey, when are you planning to pay me back for that loan?" The silence was instant and thick. Jason laughed. "Come on, Anna. It's just family. You'll always be there." I set my fork down slowly, my appetite vanishing like smoke. "I was there. And you took advantage of that." He shrugged, still smirking. "Relax. It's not like you're hurting for cash." Marion didn't say a word. She didn't defend me. Didn't even flinch. She just sipped her wine and said, "Let's not ruin dinner with negativity." And that was the last holiday I ever spent in that house with both feet in the room. After that, I still showed up sometimes, but emotionally, I was gone. I stopped bringing gifts. I stopped offering rides. I stopped answering calls after 9 p.m. I stopped trying to fix things that were never mine to fix. Detachment is a slow death, but it's also a kind of rebirth. In therapy, I talked about the concept of chosen family, about the people who see you not for what you do, but for who you are. And I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to keep offering pieces of myself to people who never said thank you. One afternoon during winter break, I walked past Jason's room and heard Marion on the phone. She was laughing softly, saying, "Jason just needs time. He's got so much potential." I stood there for a full minute listening, letting it burn. Then I turned and walked outside into the cold without a jacket. The wind hit my skin like a truth I already knew. I would never be loved the way I deserved in that house. But I could learn to love myself enough to leave it behind. And I did. Some wounds don't scar where the world can see them. Some burrow beneath the surface, taking root in the places where your trust once lived, growing vines that wrap themselves around your lungs, choking out the air every time you start to feel happy. That's what it was like for me in those first few years after college, when everything I had fought so hard to build finally started to take shape, and still, the shadow of my family stretched long behind me. I moved to Chicago just 3 weeks after graduation, an entire state away from the ghosts I'd left behind in that beige house on Elmwood Avenue. I got a job at a boutique finance firm downtown, prestigious, competitive, and full of the kind of people who thought sleep was for people with trust funds. I fit right in. I learned how to dress sharp and speak sharper. I traded ramen for raw data, learned how to read portfolios like open books, and became someone my younger self would have been proud of, if a little intimidated by. The apartment I rented had high ceilings and hardwood floors and windows that faced the city lights like I'd finally earned my own skyline. It was the first space that belonged entirely to me. I picked every piece of furniture, hung every framed quote, and painted the walls the soft blue of calm seas. I filled it with quiet, with boundaries, with peace. But even from a distance, the phone still rang. It started innocuously enough, Marion calling because the roof needed patching or the furnace was making that sound again. Jason needed help paying off an old parking ticket that had snowballed into a bench warrant. I still remember that first call clearly, sitting at my desk eating takeout sushi at 9 p.m., hearing her voice tremble slightly as she said, "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious." That line became her favorite song. And I played along at first because that was the rhythm we knew. I sent money. Quietly. Automatically. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. I set up monthly transfers for the mortgage, sent gift cards for groceries, even paid part of Jason's court fees when he got caught with something he swore wasn't even his. I told myself I was helping, that it was temporary, that maybe this time they'd see the depth of my loyalty and finally say something that resembled thank you. But they never did. Instead, every call became a withdrawal from a bank account that was never theirs to begin with. They didn't ask how I was adjusting to city life. They didn't ask if I was lonely or thriving or just surviving in the pressure cooker of Wall Street wannabes and downtown gridlock. They asked about money, always. How much? How fast? How soon? One time, when I hesitated because rent had gone up and my own student loans were looming like wolves, Marion said, "You're doing so well, Anna. It's not fair to make us suffer when you have so much." That word, fair, hit like a slap made of ice. Fair, as if all the years I spent suffocating under their indifference hadn't already paid tenfold into this family's emotional debt. Fair, as if Jason's failures were a tax I owed for being the one who got out. Still, I kept paying. Because habits, even toxic ones, don't break just because you've changed your zip code. Then I met Daniel. He was everything I didn't know I needed: steady, calm, kind in a way that wasn't performative. He noticed the way I flinched when people raised their voices and never raised his. He asked about my day and actually listened to the answers. He was an architect, with hands that built things and eyes that saw blueprints in brokenness. We met at a charity gala, bonded over bad wine, and shared eye rolls at the donors trying too hard. He called me fire hidden in frost, and for the first time in my life, I believed someone might see me for who I truly was. We moved in together after 2 years, slowly blending our lives like mixing colors on a palette. I introduced him to my work friends. He brought me to his family dinners where his mom hugged me before I'd said a word. I cried in the car afterward, overwhelmed by the simplicity of affection not earned, but offered freely. When Daniel proposed, it was on the balcony of our apartment, surrounded by candles and the sound of the city we'd both grown to love. I said yes through tears and laughter, and for a brief, shimmering moment, the weight of my past felt like something I could finally set down. I wanted them to know. I wanted them to be part of it, even though I shouldn't have. I should have known better. I called Marion first. Her response was a monotone, "That's nice, I guess," followed by a long pause and then, "So listen, the water heater's acting up again. Do you think you can cover it this month?" I tried again, this time inviting them to dinner. Just a weekend visit, nothing fancy. Meet Daniel, see my life. Sit across a table where I didn't have to be the provider, just the daughter. Marion said she had too much going on. Jason didn't bother to respond until 2 days later, with a text that read, "Busy. Maybe another time." There never was another time. 2 months before Christmas, I stopped responding to the payment reminders immediately. Work was brutal, and Daniel's mom was recovering from surgery, and honestly, I just needed a moment to breathe. 3 days after I didn't wire money for what Marion claimed was an urgent medical situation, one I couldn't verify and wasn't explained beyond, "Don't you trust your own mother?" she sent me an email. It was short, cold, unmistakably final. "If you're going to be this kind of person, selfish, ungrateful, distant, then don't bother coming for Christmas. I won't have that energy in my home." My hands shook as I read it, my coffee going cold on the desk beside me. An hour later, Jason followed up with a text that read, "El Mayo. We'll pretend we don't know you. Enjoy your city life, princess." I stared at that message until the words blurred. Then I put the phone down and walked to the kitchen, opened the drawer where I kept all the bills, the records, the charity I'd extended to a family that never once gave back. I sat at the table, opened my laptop, and one by one, like cutting old ropes, I canceled every single automatic transfer. The mortgage? Gone. The utilities? Gone. Jason's court fee installment plan? Gone. I opened my banking app, removed all saved recipients, and when the system asked if I was sure, I clicked yes without hesitation. Then I blocked every number. Marion's, Jason's, even the landline from the old house that probably hadn't been used since the Bush administration. I blocked their emails. I deleted our last Christmas photo. I took down the framed family picture from the hallway and replaced it with a painting Daniel bought me, a mountain peak under moonlight, quiet and resolute. And then I cried. Not pretty tears, not cinematic sobs. I broke open, ugly and raw and heaving, on the floor of my kitchen. Daniel found me there, holding my phone like it had become a weapon, and he didn't ask what happened. He just sat beside me, wrapped me in his arms, and let me fall apart. I grieved them that night, not just Marion and Jason, but the version of them I had been chasing since childhood. The imaginary mother who might one day say she was proud. The brother who might defend me in a room. The family who might have shown up, just once, not because I paid for the gas or promised dinner, but because they wanted to see me. That family never existed. And once I accepted that, truly accepted it, I began the hardest work of my life, choosing myself. There is a strange kind of silence that follows a final decision, the kind that doesn't echo but settles, like snow on abandoned rooftops, quiet and unshakable. That silence came after I blocked them. Not the usual silence of waiting for an apology or holding out hope. This was something colder, cleaner. A silence with boundaries. A silence that didn't ache, it exhaled. In the first year, there was peace. Not without pain, of course, because cutting out the people you once believed were your roots leaves you reeling like a tree torn from soil. But also, for the first time in my life, there was peace that I didn't have to earn by folding myself into something small and convenient. No more guilt-wrapped phone calls. No more backhanded messages disguised as family concern. No more holidays spent holding my breath at dinner tables that never had a seat for me unless I paid for it. I focused on building my own life, not just the surface-level successes that make other people clap politely at parties, but the kind of life that feels like breathing fully. I got promoted to senior portfolio strategist at my firm, took weekends off without flinching, and traveled without explaining where I was or who I was with. Daniel and I adopted a shaggy, ridiculous rescue dog named Miller who had one ear permanently bent and a bark like a grumble. I learned how to cook without burning things and how to say no without apologizing. And yet, in the quiet pockets of those first few years, information still found its way to me like wind slipping through a locked window. I didn't seek it out, but the world has a way of delivering its headlines even when you stop subscribing. I heard from an old neighbor in a chance encounter at a networking event that the house on Elmwood Avenue had been foreclosed. She told me Jason hadn't been seen around much since the sheriff's notice went up on the front lawn. She said Marion had looked thinner, tired. She said it like I should be shocked. Like I should do something. I nodded politely and changed the subject. 3 months later, a second cousin I barely remembered messaged me on Facebook, a platform I rarely used anymore, to inform me, with great urgency, that Jason had been arrested. Something about unpaid fines, a probation violation, failure to appear. The details were muddy. The tone was sharp. He always said you'd turn your back on him eventually, she wrote, as though betrayal was the crime and not the countless years of manipulation that preceded it. I didn't reply. Later that year, a letter arrived at my office addressed in Marion's handwriting, tight, slanted, and trembling in places like someone gripping too hard. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I recognized the weight of guilt sealed inside it without ever breaking the envelope. I placed it gently in the shredder, fed it to the machine like a final sacrament, and watched it disappear without a sound. But I did respond, to the ones who reached out without venom, to the distant aunts who asked not with accusation, but with curiosity. I wrote letters. Thoughtful ones. Detailed ones. Not bitter, but unflinching. I told them about my childhood, not in melodrama, but in measured memory. I told them about Christmas mornings where silence rang louder than joy, about co-signing loans I never benefited from, about begging for kindness that came only with price tags. I told them I tried. For years. That I paid. That I gave. That I forgave, and then forgave again, until I was bleeding dry with no one offering a bandage. Some wrote back with softness, I didn't know, they said. I see you now. Others didn't write at all, their silence answering the question I no longer needed to ask. Not everyone will understand your boundaries when those boundaries mean they have to see you clearly. I started spending my Saturdays volunteering at a youth center on the south side of the city, teaching financial literacy to teenage girls who reminded me too much of myself at 13. Girls who apologized before they spoke. Girls who wore silence like armor and asked questions with a sideways glance, unsure if they had permission to be heard. I told them the things I wish someone had told me. That being the strong one is not a compliment if it's just code for being everyone's punching bag. That you are allowed to walk away from people who hurt you, even if they share your last name. That forgiveness does not require access, and love without respect is not love at all, it is servitude. I told them that self-worth is not built on sacrifice alone, and no amount of loyalty will fix someone who refuses to be accountable. They listened. Some cried. Some didn't. But they heard me. And that, in its own way, healed parts of me no therapist ever could. One girl, Sierra, reminded me so much of myself it hurt. She was 15, brilliant, sarcastic, and carried herself like a hurricane in a bottle. She once said, "I don't even know what it's like to be wanted without earning it." And I looked her in the eye and told her, "Then we'll build it from scratch. You and me. From now on." It was that year, my 32nd, that I truly began to believe in the concept of chosen family, not as a poetic ideal, but as something real and tangible and stronger than blood. Daniel, with his endless patience and hands that still reached for me on bad days. Miller, the dog who sat beside me every night like he understood grief in his bones. My friends, Marisol, who brought me soup when I got the flu and never asked questions. Cam, who always knew when to say, "That was messed up," without trying to fix me. On Christmas Eve of that year, our apartment smelled like cinnamon and cider. The tree stood crooked because Miller had knocked it sideways chasing a squirrel on TV. The floor was scattered with blankets and laughter. We had no assigned seating, no dress code, no obligation. Just people who had chosen to show up and love one another, not for usefulness, not for money, but for presence alone. I sat on the couch, watching snow fall in quiet drifts outside the window, and let the silence wash over me, not the old silence of neglect, but a new one, warm and full. Later that night, I opened my phone and stared at the last message Jason had ever sent me, just before I blocked his number. It was short, typical, venom masked as bravado. "You were nothing without us." I read it again, slowly, as if examining a fossil of someone I no longer mourned. Then I smiled, faintly, not bitterly, and whispered into the quiet, "I was nothing because of you. And now I'm free." And that was the truest thing I had ever said. There comes a time in a woman's life, not marked by birthdays or promotions or gray hairs creeping in at the temples, but by silence. A kind of silence that doesn't ache, doesn't press in from the outside, but expands from within. It's the silence of no longer needing anything from people who never knew how to love you right. It's the quiet knowing that your survival was never owed to anyone but yourself. I felt that silence settle into my bones somewhere around my 42nd birthday, as I sat in a quiet cabin tucked away near Lake Geneva, watching the snow turn everything into soft silhouettes. It had taken me years to arrive at that place, not geographically, but spiritually. The place where peace no longer required closure from others, where healing didn't hinge on an apology finally arriving like a belated Christmas card. I'd stopped waiting for that moment a long time ago, but still, I knew something was unfinished, not broken, just open, waiting to become something more than pain. That's when I began to write. The book wasn't planned. It wasn't part of any resolution or bucket list or midlife epiphany. It began as a letter to the girl I once was, the girl who sat on her bedroom floor holding a handmade gift, waiting for someone to say she mattered. I wrote to her with the tenderness I never received, telling her that she wasn't invisible, wasn't too much, wasn't not enough. That letter turned into a chapter, and that chapter turned into pages and pages of memories I had buried beneath success and silence. I titled the memoir The Gift They Didn't Want. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't an exposé. It was an offering. A map of a life rebuilt without permission. a record of resilience carved from neglect. And in every paragraph, I left space for softness, because while strength got me out, softness was what let me stay out. The first time I read the draft aloud to Daniel, sitting cross-legged on our living room floor with Miller's head resting in his lap, he didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick. "You didn't just survive them, Anna. You transcended them." The book came out when I was 45. A modest press took a chance on it after one of my former men's, Sierra, now a published poet herself, sent it unsolicited to an editor she knew. I never intended for it to be public. I thought maybe 10 people would read it. But it spread quietly, like a shared secret in the hands of people who needed to hear it. Women wrote to me. Men wrote to me. Estranged daughters and invisible sons, forgotten siblings and grown-up children who still flinched when the phone rang. They didn't ask for advice. They thanked me for saying out loud what they hadn't yet had the words for. And then, one day, I received a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A real letter in faded cursive, the envelope worn at the corners and addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in decades. The return address was a care facility in Iowa. Marion. My hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the magnitude of what it meant to hold a piece of something I had long since released. I didn't open it right away. I sat with it on my lap for an hour, letting the weight of it press into my thighs, letting the memory of her voice float through the room like a fading perfume. When I finally opened it, the letter was short. Not dramatic. Not manipulative. It simply read, "Anna, I won't waste time with justifications. I was wrong. You deserved more than I gave you. You were always more than I could see. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted to say that before it's too late. Marion." I folded it slowly, pressing the creases as if sealing away a part of myself that had been waiting, still, to be seen. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat in the stillness and let the warmth of that sentence settle somewhere deep in the hollows where her absence used to live. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. Jason never contacted me again. Not for money. Not for forgiveness. Not even when the book came out and family gossip started circling like vultures around the edges of curiosity. He disappeared into whatever life he had built from the ruins of entitlement, and I let him. Letting go is easier when there is nothing left to carry. And then, one autumn morning, I returned to Elmwood Avenue. The house was abandoned by then, window panes dust-covered, the swing set rusted and half-buried in weeds. The paint peeled like tired skin, and the porch groaned under the weight of time and regret. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I simply stood on the sidewalk where I once rode my bike in silent laps, hoping someone would look up and wave. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a handmade ornament, clay, glazed in soft blue, the same shade I painted my apartment all those years ago. Shaped like a heart, simple and imperfect. In the center, carved carefully with the tip of a pen, was one word. I set it on the porch railing where no one might see it and turned away before the wind could knock it down. And so I walked away again, but this time with no anger in my chest, no ache in my lungs, and no weight on my shoulders. Only breath. Only peace. By 50, my home looked nothing like the house I grew up in and everything like the life I had earned. Every Christmas, I opened my doors wide to those who had no place to go. Former men's, their partners, single mothers, foster teens, friends who had grown estranged from their own families and found refuge in each other's kindness. We cooked together, laughed too loud, sang off-key, and left the dishes until morning. No one had to pay. No one had to prove. Everyone had a seat. Miller, older now, slept beneath the tree with a red bough around his neck. Daniel, silver at the temples and still calling me Stormheart, wrapped his arms around my waist as the lights flickered across our memories. And I stood in the center of it all, this life, this warmth, this joy, and whispered to myself, this is what healing looks like. I had become the woman I once needed, and that, more than anything, is the legacy I will leave behind.